Hey guys, I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, what's the most unexpected or unusual thing about your hometown that most people wouldn't guess? Maybe it's a bizarre local tradition, a strange local food, or something that makes your place stand out. Can't wait to hear your stories. James Bennett was 54 years old and had been married to Olivia for 33 of those years. They lived in a quiet suburb of a Midwestern city. For most of their marriage, James and Olivia navigated the usual rhythms of adulthood, raising two children, paying off a mortgage, hosting large family gatherings for Thanksgiving. Both children were now grown, one living in Colorado, the other in a nearby university town. They rarely came home except for holidays or big celebrations. When the last child finally moved out, Olivia and James found themselves alone in a house that suddenly felt too spacious. In those early weeks of their empty nest, James and Olivia shared the optimistic joke that they would finally have the place to themselves, free to enjoy quiet mornings or spontaneous date nights. They had always been loyal to each other, or so James believed. He had built his life around the principle of lifelong commitment. Divorce, to him, was out of the question, a sentiment that sprang from his strict upbringing in a military household. His father had been an army officer who taught James discipline from an early age: morning chores, tight schedules, unwavering honesty. After high school, James briefly followed in his father's footsteps, enlisting in the Army. He never saw active combat, but the structure of military life left an indelible mark on him. It taught him resilience, stoicism, and the importance of always having a plan. That bedrock of discipline served James well later in life. After the Army, he worked his way through college on the GI Bill, studying finance. Eventually, he transitioned into a stable job at a regional bank. His day-to-day role in loan management combined the precision of numbers with the interpersonal challenge of helping families secure mortgages. He spent nearly 2 decades building a comfortable career. In his spare time, he stayed active: tennis on the weekends, occasional racquetball matches with his best friend Richard, and jogs through the neighborhood before sunrise. Yet at 52, his comfortable existence teetered when doctors diagnosed him with prostate cancer. The phone call with the results sent him reeling. Up to that point, he had felt strong and healthy, rarely even catching a cold. But now the word cancer hung over his life, overshadowing everything else. The recommended treatments were aggressive, but promising. Over the course of a grueling year, James underwent surgery and rounds of hormone therapy, which successfully contained the cancer at the cost of unsettling side effects. Within 6 months, he had gained 45 pounds, most of it stubbornly clinging to his midsection. Gone was the lithe, strong physique he had maintained for decades. Suddenly, he found himself winded after climbing a few flights of stairs or carrying groceries. Initially, Olivia rose to the challenge. She was an HR consultant at a large firm in the city, known for her confident manner and impeccable appearance. She requested a few weeks of flexible scheduling to accompany James to medical appointments and handle his post-surgery care. During those early months, it felt as though the cancer had brought them closer, forging a private world where she was his rock and caretaker. He noticed how diligently she took notes at every doctor's visit, how lovingly she prepared bland but nutritious meals when his appetite waned. At night, he would gaze at her sleeping form, grateful that he had such a supportive partner. Everything shifted, however, once the doctors gave James an excellent prognosis. The relief he felt at hearing he was likely cancer-free was profound. But Olivia's demeanor cooled almost instantly. Her once devoted concern began to recede. She stopped offering to drive him to follow-up visits, citing her job responsibilities. James rationalized that perhaps she was simply exhausted after the stressful months of his treatment. He tried not to read too much into it. But soon came the small, cutting remarks about his weight, how puffy he looked, how maybe he should lay off the carbs. Olivia had always been vain about appearances, meticulously maintaining her makeup and outfits. Now, James sensed that her fixation on physical image extended to him in a way that felt cruel. She would say things like, "You really let yourself go," or "Have you seen how Richard manages to stay fit? Why can't you do that?" Each comparison to Richard stung, given that Richard was still single, still built like a man half his age, and still found time to run daily 5-mile jogs. Determined not to give up, James tried everything: keto diets, daily weigh-ins, extended walks. He forced himself to walk at least 10,000 steps each morning, rising before sunrise and pacing through neighborhood sidewalks. At times, the neighbors would wave as they drove past, offering casual hellos. He put on a friendly face, refusing to let them see how deeply Olivia's barbs were cutting him. The scale, unfortunately, refused to budge more than a pound here or there. Hormone therapy had altered his metabolism, leaving him feeling defeated whenever he stepped off the scale. Olivia, for her part, only grew more distant and often downright critical. Her evening routine involved washing off her makeup and meticulously applying anti-aging creams, all the while complaining that James was too out of shape or that his presence embarrassed her. She was especially paranoid about how others perceived them when they attended social events. James's confidence withered under her incessant criticisms, but a deep part of him maintained that he was still the strong, disciplined man he had always been, just temporarily set back by health problems. He believed, with a survivor's mentality, that if he could beat cancer, he could beat anything, including the strain on his marriage. He would soon learn, however, that there were some betrayals beyond the reach of positive thinking. In mid-July, when the Midwest heat felt like a constant muggy blanket, James returned from his morning 10,000 step walk to an unsettling silence that lingered in the house. The sun had already begun its ascent, casting harsh shadows and amplifying the intensity of the humidity. It was about 7:30 a.m. The forecast promised another scorching day in the mid-90s, complete with sticky, oppressive humidity. Sweat dripped down James's neck, staining his shirt as he made his way through the front door. The thick air seemed to cling to him, seeping into the house even before he stepped inside. The house, typically vibrant with morning life, felt eerily empty. His footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor, the absence of Olivia's usual morning chatter hanging in the air like a cloud. The keys, clinking softly as he dropped them onto the wooden side table by the door, marked the transition from the outside world to the uncertain one he was about to face inside. His stomach turned, an uneasy sensation creeping up his spine. There was something about the atmosphere, a weight in the air, that made him pause as though sensing a shift in the fabric of his life. A change that he couldn't quite pinpoint, but could feel in his bones. He wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing around. The kitchen, typically the hub of their mornings, appeared untouched. A few crumbs remained on the counter, remnants of the last night's dinner that she hadn't bothered to clean up, a small detail James noted. Olivia was standing at the kitchen island, sipping from a tall glass of iced water. She flashed a dazzling smile, the kind of smile that could light up a room. Yet it failed to mask the nervous energy radiating from her. Her movements were quick, almost too sharp. She was jittery, not her usual composed self. "Hey, honey," she said, her voice a little too bright, like she was trying too hard. "How was your walk?" James paused, taking in her overly sweet tone and the slight tremor in her hand. It wasn't like Olivia to be this eager or unnaturally cheerful before her second cup of coffee. She was always a slow starter in the mornings, preferring silence over conversation until her mind was fully awake. He forced a smile, trying to appear casual, but his mind was already racing, trying to make sense of the subtle clues she was dropping, or rather, the ones she was desperately trying to hide. "It was fine," he replied, his voice betraying nothing, though his mind was sharp, analyzing every word and gesture. His eyes flicked over to her damp hair, clinging to her neck in a way that struck him as odd. Olivia had always insisted on showering at night, citing the need for a relaxing ritual after her long days filled with stressful HR consulting. She never liked showers in the morning, saying it disrupted her routine. And yet here she was, freshly showered, looking as though she had just stepped out of the bathroom. The incongruity of it sent a chill down his spine. "I'll grab a quick shower myself," he muttered, keeping his tone even, despite the rush of questions threatening to burst free. He needed to calm himself, to hold on to the veneer of normalcy that was slipping away. But as he turned to head toward their master bedroom, the air seemed to thicken around him. There was something wrong. Something had shifted. As he stepped through the threshold of their bedroom, a wave of discomfort surged through him. The smell, he could smell it even before he crossed the threshold, hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the familiar, comforting scent of their sheets or the faint trace of Olivia's floral body lotion. No, this was something heavier, musky, stale. The unmistakable odor of recent, intense intimacy. James froze. The bed was made, neatly arranged, as was customary, but there was a distinct difference in the air, an invisible mark left behind that only someone who had been here before would notice. His heart began to race, a cold pit forming in his stomach. He exhaled slowly, trying to ground himself, to make sense of what he was sensing. He stepped further into the room, his eyes drawn immediately to the bathroom. The light was on. It shouldn't have been on. Olivia never left the lights on. In fact, she would often complain if James left the bathroom light on after his own shower. A trivial thing, but it was always one of those small, habitual things that became part of the rhythm of their lives. Yet now, the light was blazing. He couldn't ignore it. He walked toward the bathroom, trying to suppress the growing anxiety that was bubbling up within him. The mirror was fogged, the condensation still hanging in the air, a sign that someone had recently used it. But it was the bottle of men's shower gel, his shower gel, that caught his eye, uncapped, with a dollop of soap trailing down the side. A brand he had used for years, one that Olivia had always criticized for smelling too masculine, too musky. She had always made a point of telling him how she hated it. But here it was, out in the open, as if someone else had used it. James's mind reeled. There was only one explanation for this. Someone had been in the shower. Someone had used his gel, someone who wasn't Olivia. He clenched his fists, the tightness in his chest growing as a wave of anger swept over him. He fought to keep his breathing steady, to keep the searing rush of rage under control. He couldn't let Olivia see his reaction. Not yet. He flicked off the bathroom light and walked back to the kitchen, his feet moving on autopilot. Olivia was still at the counter, her focus on her phone, though her eyes darted nervously when she saw him approach. He could feel her watching him, the tension in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. His pulse was racing, but he masked it with practiced indifference as he slipped an arm around her waist, burying his face against her neck. Her body stiffened as though she could feel the heat of his anger radiating through his touch. He inhaled, checking for any hint of his shower gel. Nothing. Just her usual floral shampoo, a scent that had long since become a part of her. He repressed the urge to shudder. There was nothing that tied her to him anymore. Not in this moment. The distance between them felt infinite. "Forgot to say a proper good morning," he murmured, his voice deceptively soft. He could feel the faint tremor in her muscles as she forced a laugh, stepping away from him as though his touch had burned her. She couldn't meet his gaze. Her eyes darted away, focusing on anything but him. If there had been another man in the house, he was long gone now. The question that clawed at his mind, the one that refused to let go, was this: who could it be? For a split second, an ugly thought surfaced. Richard, a name that James had pushed to the back of his mind for years. Richard had been Olivia's close colleague, her confidant. Their relationship had always been purely professional. But James knew better than to ignore the quiet sparks of tension that had existed between them. The way Olivia spoke of Richard, always with a certain fondness, an unspoken bond that James had never quite understood, was something he had learned to overlook. Until now. Could it have been Richard? The thought gnawed at him, a bitter taste filling his mouth. But he couldn't let himself dwell on it, not yet. He had to be sure. He had to know what was really happening before he made any accusations. James arrived at work that morning with a gnawing unease sitting heavy in his gut. His mind was scattered, thoughts circling back to Olivia, her distant smiles, her vague responses, the tension that had crept into their conversations. He had always been a man who trusted his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was wrong. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He pushed back from his desk, exhaling sharply as he rubbed his temple. His boss, Greg, noticed. "You okay, James?" Greg asked, leaning against the doorway. "You look pale." James hesitated for half a second before giving a slow nod. "Not feeling great," he admitted. "Think I might head home early." Greg studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the door. "Yeah, go ahead. You've been putting in the hours. Get some rest." James offered a clipped, "Thanks," then grabbed his keys and walked out. He wasn't sick, at least not in the way Greg assumed, but there was an urgency inside him, a feeling that if he didn't get home now, he'd regret it. The drive back was a blur, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The moment he pulled into the driveway, he moved with quiet precision, slipping inside without making a sound. The silence felt different. The air was heavy. Olivia's perfume still faintly lingered from her morning routine, but James barely noticed. His focus was singular, straight to the bedroom. His heart pounded as he approached her nightstand, where her laptop sat closed and waiting. His fingers hovered over the lid. He had never crossed this line before, never felt the need to. But Olivia had already crossed a far worse line. Jaw tight, he flipped the laptop open. The login screen greeted him. He typed in the password, the one he had seen her use dozens of times, though he had never cared to memorize it until now. The screen flickered, then loaded instantly. His breath steadied. Then he began searching. Emails, HR memos, employee reports, the usual. His eyes moved quickly, scanning through the inbox with practiced efficiency. Nothing outright suspicious, but Olivia was careful, always had been. She wouldn't leave something damning out in the open. Then he saw it. Cruise confirmation. Thank you for booking. A chill ran through him. He clicked the tab, eyes darting across the details. A luxury cruise. A week-long Caribbean itinerary. The departure date, Monday, just 5 days away. 2 passengers. His pulse slowed, thick and heavy in his veins. 2. His first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe she had planned this as a surprise for them both. But as he kept reading, his stomach twisted. His name wasn't anywhere. The booking was made under Olivia's personal email, tied to a credit card he didn't recognize. A separate account. A hidden account. She's going with someone else. James felt his breath coming slower, heavier. His hands curled around the laptop edges, white-knuckled. A sharp ding from his phone broke the silence. He grabbed it, glancing at the screen. A text from Olivia. Honey, a new department is opening soon, and I need to be there for quite some time. Maybe a month. I'm leaving next Monday. Sorry for the late notice. He stared at the words, his world collapsing around him. A month? His mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but none existed. Olivia's job had never required abrupt extended travel. She wasn't going for work. She was leaving, for him. His heart pounded so hard it nearly drowned out the thoughts flooding his mind. Who the hell is she going with? Richard. A bitter laugh almost escaped his throat, but the rage rising in his chest snuffed it out. It has to be Richard, the man she compared him to, the one she constantly praised. Fit, confident, single. James clenched his teeth, fury simmering just beneath the surface. If they're planning to spend a week together on that damn cruise, I swear to God, I will end them both. His breathing slowed, controlled. The initial wave of rage didn't fade, but it shifted. No longer blind, no longer reckless. It hardened into something colder, strategic. He had been blindsided once before, when the doctor told him he had cancer. It had knocked him down, stripped him of control, forced him to rebuild himself piece by piece. But he had survived. He had come back stronger. This would be no different. His fingers loosened around the phone and he took another steady breath. He couldn't let Olivia see his anger, not yet. If he confronted her now, she'd deny everything. She'd gaslight him, twist the story, make him doubt what he already knew was true. No, not this time. He glanced at the text again, then typed a reply. That's sudden, but okay. We'll talk more when you get home. Love you. He stared at the words for a moment, then hit send. His heart was still thudding in his chest, but his mind was already working ahead, calculating. He needed confirmation, proof. And when he had it, Olivia would regret ever thinking she could lie to him. James wasn't the type to act on impulse. His father, a former army officer, had drilled it into him early on. Patience, strategy, and thinking things through before making a move. His father's code had stuck with him through the years, especially when it came to personal matters. So instead of confronting Olivia directly with his suspicions, James decided to gather some evidence. If he was going to find out the truth, he'd do it the way he was taught, calmly, methodically, and without making a scene. That's how he ended up driving down to the small, unremarkable shop just outside downtown. He'd found it through a quick online search the night before, after spending hours turning over every possible scenario in his head. The place wasn't much to look at, a tiny shop wedged between 2 larger buildings, its faded sign barely visible behind the clutter of nearby stores. But the shop had what he needed: surveillance equipment, audio recorders, hidden cameras, GPS trackers, all the tools that would let him find out exactly what Olivia had been up to. When he walked in, the air inside was cool, but there was something about it that felt stale, like it hadn't been refreshed in a while. The fluorescent lights above flickered as they buzzed incessantly, casting a harsh, almost nauseating light over the rows of gadgets. Glass display cases lined the walls, filled with all sorts of small, discrete devices that promised to capture everything from conversations to movements. Some of them were so small they could be tucked into the tiniest of spaces and go unnoticed. James felt a tightness in his chest as he walked past them, his mind racing through the possibilities of what he might find and what he might learn. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to need to be there, but he did. The clerk behind the counter didn't look up right away. When he did, it was with the kind of mild curiosity that suggested he had seen his fair share of strange requests. He was a wiry guy, maybe in his late 20s, with tired eyes and a long, unkempt beard. His voice was flat, the kind of tone that said he had been doing this too long to care about the particulars. "Can I help you find something?" the clerk asked, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he sized James up. James took a breath and tried to keep his voice steady. "I'd like high-quality audio bugs," he said carefully, making sure his words were deliberate. "Small, easy to conceal." The clerk nodded and didn't hesitate. Without a word, he turned and started rummaging through a drawer under the counter. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and determination. This wasn't how he imagined his day going. He wasn't a man who relied on gadgets or secrecy. His life had been built on trust, on straightforward communication. But now, with Olivia, that trust had crumbled, and in its place was something darker, something that needed answers. A moment later, the clerk returned with two small devices. He placed them on the counter, each one looking as unobtrusive as it was functional. "These are just audio," the clerk explained, tapping one of the devices with a finger. "No video. They're voice-activated, and they store the data on a small chip. You won't have to worry about them being discovered unless someone's actively looking for them. The range is decent, too." James took a closer look at the gadgets. The first one was shaped like a tiny button, the kind you might find on a coat or shirt. It looked like it could be easily slipped under a bed frame or inside a couch cushion without anyone noticing. The second device had an adhesive back, making it easy to stick inside a purse, on the underside of a table, or in any number of other hidden spots. Neither of them looked particularly sophisticated, but that was the point. They were discreet, small, effective. He didn't hesitate. He chose both of them. The clerk was already bagging them before James could say anything more. The transaction was quick, too quick. James paid in cash, deliberately keeping his movements slow and controlled. He didn't want to seem like someone who was buying surveillance gear for the first time. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He felt a pang of discomfort as the clerk handed him the bag, his fingers brushing the worn paper. Was this paranoia, or was he just being practical? James couldn't tell anymore. It was hard to know what was rational when his whole world seemed to be shifting underneath him. As he left the shop, the cool air hit him like a wave. It didn't help. His mind was too preoccupied, turning over the details he had gathered, trying to make sense of the tension that had been building between him and Olivia. What had he really been feeling all these weeks? Had he seen signs before? Tiny things he had overlooked? Or was this just a case of suspicion running wild, fed by his own insecurities? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had to find out the truth, even if it meant crossing a line he never thought he would cross. As he drove home, the bag containing the devices sat on the passenger seat beside him. He kept glancing at it, unsure whether to feel guilty or relieved. Part of him wanted to turn around and go back, to put the whole thing out of his mind. But the other part of him, the part that had spent months stewing in uncertainty, knew there was no turning back now. He had already made the choice. When he got home, the house felt quieter than usual. The hum of the air conditioner in the background only amplified the silence. Olivia wasn't there, no surprise there. She had been working late most nights, spending more time out of the house than in it. He could feel his pulse quicken as he set the bag down on the kitchen counter. The gadgets were innocuous, small enough to be hidden anywhere. But the question that lingered heavy in his chest was whether the truth he was about to uncover would be something he could live with. That night, once Olivia had gone to bed, James quietly set about planting the devices. He slid the first bug under the bed frame, taping it securely to a wooden cross-slat to ensure it wouldn't slip. The second, he affixed within the lining of her favorite purse, a large, stylish tote she carried daily. If Olivia was having explicit conversations with a lover, these bugs should pick them up. Day 1, he retrieved the audio from the bedroom device. Nothing but the hum of air conditioning, some rustling of sheets, Olivia's occasional sleep mumblings. Day 2, the same. He almost doubted his plan. Perhaps she was meeting the other man somewhere else entirely. Day 3, everything changed. During his lunch break from the bank, James opened the recording from the purse bug on his phone. Wedged in his parked SUV with a half-eaten turkey sandwich in the passenger seat, he pressed play. Olivia's laughter, light and girlish, crackled through the speaker. He hadn't heard her laugh that way in years. Olivia, I told you we should meet outside. That fat idiot is getting suspicious. Man's voice. I don't care. I want him to watch while You. Imagine his face. Olivia. Oh, you pervert. Man's voice. Just thinking about his pathetic face turns me on. Olivia. Maybe I should invite him to watch. Maybe he'll lose some weight out of shock. Man's voice. I doubt it. He'd probably just cry in the corner like a loser. James's breath came in ragged gasps, fists tightening on the steering wheel. Olivia's cruelty toward him, calling him fat idiot, referencing his weight, was one gut punch. The man's vile words about wanting James to watch was another. The final nail in the coffin was the complete lack of shame or compassion in Olivia's voice. He replayed the audio, ensuring he hadn't imagined it. The voice was definitely male, with a cocky edge, not Richard. James recalled meeting one of Olivia's new colleagues a few months prior at a casual office get-together, Patrick Dalton, a 41-year-old with a smug air about him. He was known to be brash, always flirting, though James had never suspected he might target Olivia. James felt a surge of rage so potent he nearly drove straight to Olivia's office to confront her. But reason halted him. He had the advantage of knowing the truth, while she assumed he was clueless. Lashing out now would only let them cover their tracks. He needed to ensure his revenge was absolute. In the days that followed, James continued to feign ignorance. He let Olivia babble about flight times, about the business trip demands. He quietly did her bidding, setting aside his own growing sense of violation. If she found it odd that he wasn't more curious, she did not show it. Perhaps she was too caught up in the excitement of her planned affair. James's emotions burned inside him like embers, fueling a single-minded resolve to destroy the cushy life Olivia and Patrick believed they would enjoy. He was no stranger to challenges. He had overcome cancer, endured painful therapies, and survived the Army's rigorous discipline in his younger years. He reminded himself that he was not weak. He was simply a man who rarely unleashed his anger. But once unleashed, it would be cold and unstoppable. On Sunday, the day before Olivia's flight, James insisted on a quiet night in. She left in the morning for a nail appointment and some last-minute errands. He spent those hours methodically putting phase 1 of his plan into action. James had spent years working in banking. He understood financial systems better than most, and more importantly, he understood how to move money without drawing immediate suspicion. Olivia never paid close attention to their accounts. She had long since assumed that James was too straightforward for financial maneuvering. That assumption was about to cost her dearly. He logged into their joint accounts, studying the balances, considering his options. Over the years, he had maintained a personal bank account, a leftover from his single days, which he had treated as an emergency fund. It wasn't much, just a comfortable sum tucked away in case of disaster. Today, that fund would serve a new purpose. With a series of carefully calculated transfers, James moved the majority of their shared money into his private account. He left just enough in the joint account to avoid immediate suspicion, enough to pay the bills for the next month, just in case Olivia checked. The rest, gone. He wasn't finished. Next, he turned his attention to the mortgage. The house had originally been under both their names, but James had spent the past several years making the majority of the payments. That gave him leverage. With his expertise, he knew exactly which loopholes to exploit. He called their mortgage lender, requesting to update the ownership details. Since Olivia was listed as a co-owner but had not contributed significantly in recent years, James played the angle of refinancing and sole responsibility. A minor paperwork shuffle, some forged signatures, made easier by his knowledge of banking protocols, and by the end of the call, the house was solely his. Olivia had no legal claim to it anymore. By the time she returned home, her nails freshly painted a glossy pink, James had already sealed her fate. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. Olivia was supposed to head to the airport around noon. James had told her he would be in the office until late, finalizing some urgent banking files. She left first, rolling a medium-sized suitcase to her car, wearing a fitted blouse and skirt that highlighted her figure. There was a triumphant gleam in her eye as she said goodbye. She believed she was escaping consequence-free. The moment her car disappeared down the street, James called a moving company. They arrived within an hour, loading up virtually every piece of Olivia's personal property, her clothes, her shoes, her personal mementos, from the closets and dressers. James had spent the weekend packing them into sturdy boxes. Atop the largest box, he placed an envelope containing 2 items: his wedding ring, snapped cleanly in half, a short note reading, "Welcome to your new old home." He provided the movers with Olivia's mother's address, paying extra for same-day delivery. Then he phoned a local locksmith who came and changed every lock in the house: front door, back door, garage entrance. By late morning, James's home no longer belonged to Olivia in any practical sense. Across town, in the bustling airport terminal, Olivia prepared to board her flight to Florida, where she planned a rendezvous with Patrick for a luxury cruise. She was about to scan her boarding pass at the gate when her phone rang. Mom was on the caller ID. Normally, Olivia might have ignored it, but guilt tugged at her, urging her to answer. She stepped aside, pressing the phone to her ear. "Olivia, what the heck is going on?" Her mother's voice crackled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "A delivery truck just pulled up and dumped 8 massive boxes on my porch. They're saying it's all your stuff, your clothes, your pictures, even your shoes, and there's a note sitting on top." A cold wave of confusion washed over Olivia. That doesn't make any sense. Are you sure? Maybe the movers screwed up." Her mother cut her off, her voice sharpening. "There's a note, Olivia, and your husband's wedding ring, snapped clean in half. What the heck is going on between you two?" In a matter of seconds, Olivia's carefree excitement disintegrated. She tried calling James, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried Patrick. The call rang and rang. Her mother kept hurling questions. "Are you divorcing? Why is your stuff here?" Olivia could barely offer a coherent reply. The floor felt like it was falling out from beneath her. Panicked, she abandoned her plan to board and raced to the parking garage to retrieve her car. Within hours, she was back in their Midwestern suburb, stunned to discover she could no longer unlock the front door. The locks had been changed. Furious, she pounded on the door, calling James's name. Silence greeted her. Neighbors peeked through windows, but offered no help. She tried her old key on the back door. No luck. James had not only discovered her betrayal, he had used it as an opportunity to toss her out of her own life. She ended up driving to her mother's house, a place she despised visiting. Her mother always reminded her of her earlier years, when she was a small-town girl longing for more sophistication. That evening at her mother's, Olivia faced a barrage of questions. Her mother was outraged at the boxes cluttering the living room, furious that Olivia had apparently embroiled herself in some scandal. Olivia, for her part, withheld the truth about her affair with Patrick. She claimed James had gone insane or become paranoid after his cancer ordeal. As the night wore on, her mother's anger gave way to cold disapproval. They shouted at each other, culminating in Olivia retreating to her old childhood bedroom with tears in her eyes. She felt cornered and humiliated. Around 1 a.m., just as Olivia had finally begun to doze, her phone vibrated on the bedside table. She blinked at the screen. A FaceTime request from James. A flicker of hope mingled with dread. Perhaps he was ready to talk, to revert to that gentle man she once knew. She tapped accept. The screen opened to reveal James's face lit by harsh artificial lighting. Wind whipped at his hair. Behind him lay an expansive blackness dotted by faint distant lights. Her throat tightened. "James?" she said, voice trembling. The phone's camera panned sideways, revealing a sight that turned her blood to ice. Patrick, tied to a chair. His eyes were wide with terror, a gag muffling his pleas. Next to him stood James, wearing a calm expression that bordered on eerie. Olivia jolted upright so violently that the headboard slammed against the wall. "James! What the are you doing?" James stared into the camera, his voice eerily steady. "You called me a loser, said I was weak. Let's see who the real loser is now." The phone tilted, revealing the endless stretch of black ocean behind him. Olivia's stomach twisted, the room spinning as a wave of nausea crashed over her. Her ears rang as Patrick let out a muffled scream, thrashing against the ropes, biting into his wrists. "Please, man!" Patrick's voice cracked with desperation. "I was just messing around! Please!" James didn't even acknowledge the plea. He gripped Patrick's collar in one swift motion, yanking him up like dead weight. "You remember what you said? That you wanted me to watch while you took my wife?" His lips curled in cold amusement. "Now you watch." He dragged Patrick toward the railing, angling the phone so Olivia had a front row seat to the man's wild, terror-stricken eyes. Patrick kicked, twisted, anything to break free. But James was immovable. With one decisive motion, he shoved Patrick over the edge. A guttural scream tore from Olivia's throat as the phone slipped from her trembling hands, landing in a heap of blankets. Her breath hitched, chest heaving, hot tears streaking her face. Panic clawed at her ribs. She scrambled, fingers fumbling to snatch the phone back up, her vision blurred by fear. The screen flickered. James was still there, unmoved, expression unreadable. "No!" Olivia choked, gasping between sobs. "James, oh my God, what did you—" Her voice cracked, barely a whisper now. "What did you do?" But the call cut off, the screen fading to black. All that remained was her own reflection, hollow-eyed and shaking, staring back at her. Panic exploded in her chest. She tried calling back. Voicemail. She stared at the phone in disbelief, replaying the horrifying final image. Patrick, arms flailing, vanishing into the endless ocean. Had James truly become a murderer? Was Patrick drowned? She lurched off the bed, stumbling toward the door. Her mother, alarmed by the commotion, flung it open. Olivia could barely articulate what she had just seen. The mother's expression soon shifted from anger to sheer horror as she tried to console her trembling daughter. James ended the FaceTime call and stood on the deck, the wind rushing past him. He felt no remorse. A sense of cold satisfaction settled in the pit of his stomach. Overhead, the moon was a pale sliver, illuminating the gentle crest of waves. Patrick's final scream had faded into the hush of the sea, and James allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. This had been weeks in the making, meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. James knew that for his revenge to be successful, it had to be clean. No loose ends, no connections, no trail leading back to him. He had always been a disciplined man, methodical in his thinking, and that discipline had guided every step of this plan. Long before the cruise, James had taken the first and most important step, erasing himself from the equation. He could not afford to leave any trace that would tie him to Patrick's disappearance. For this, he needed a second identity, one that would allow him to operate freely without suspicion. James had spent weeks acquiring the necessary documents: passport, driver's license, credit cards, and even social security information, under the alias Daniel Mercer. A former Army contact, who now specialized in discreetly fabricating identities, had provided him with everything he needed. Daniel Mercer was a fully functioning persona, complete with a digital footprint, a rental history, and even minor online transactions that made him look like any ordinary traveler. James booked his ticket for the cruise under this name, paid in cash at a third-party travel agency that did not require extensive verification, and arranged for an offshore bank account to handle any unexpected expenses. Every detail was accounted for. No transactions could be traced back to James Bennett. James understood that an event like a man falling overboard would eventually raise questions. But he also knew cruise ships were like small floating cities, crowded, chaotic, and full of people too preoccupied with their vacations to notice anything suspicious. More importantly, he knew about blind spots. Through a mix of research and bribery, he pinpointed the weakest areas in the ship's security system. He learned that certain sections had outdated cameras with grainy footage, or none at all. Crew members who had been on the ship for years confirmed which stairwells and deck corners were the least patrolled. This knowledge was crucial. When James led Patrick to the chosen spot, a deserted maintenance stairwell near the lower deck, he ensured that no cameras would capture the moment of execution. James had waited until Patrick was comfortable, lulled by the luxury of the cruise, before making his move. He had observed him throughout the day, watching him drink, flirt, boast about his business success. At precisely 11 p.m., James texted Patrick from an anonymous number. "Meet me on deck 9. Private conversation, urgent." Patrick arrived, expecting something else entirely. James stepped out of the shadows. Patrick's smug expression faltered. "What the—" "I wanted to see the man Olivia risked everything for," James said, voice dangerously low. Patrick chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Oh, this is rich. You're here to fight for her? That's pathetic." James didn't react. He simply watched as Patrick took a step back, uneasy now. "I mean," Patrick continued, a cruel grin forming, "you was married to your wife all your life, and she never let you come into her little hole. But she gave it to me." James exhaled, steady. He had been prepared for something vile, but the sheer arrogance in Patrick's voice sent ice through his veins. Without hesitation, James struck. A stun gun pressed against Patrick's ribs sent 50,000 volts through his body. He collapsed, gasping. James swiftly bound his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties, then wrapped duct tape over his mouth. James took no chances. He wiped the railing clean with disposable gloves before discarding them into the ocean. Any footprints left on the damp deck would blend into the moisture. His clothing was layered. Beneath his jacket, he wore another shirt. He removed the outer layer and stuffed it into a plastic bag, later tossing it overboard as well. By the time he returned to his suite, there was no physical evidence of his presence at the scene. The next morning, as the ship docked in the Bahamas, James, under the identity of Daniel Mercer, casually disembarked. He took a direct flight out of the country within hours, leaving no trace of James Bennett having ever been on that ship. The brilliance of James's plan lay in its simplicity. Patrick was never officially on the ship. Olivia had booked the cruise, but Patrick's name was not registered on any manifest. No missing person report could be filed. Security footage showed nothing. There were no cameras covering the precise area where Patrick went overboard. The ocean was vast and unforgiving. No body meant no investigation. James's real identity never appeared on the ship. Daniel Mercer was the only man who traveled, and Daniel Mercer had already disappeared. Even if Olivia suspected something, she had no proof. Her frantic accusations would be dismissed as paranoia. James sat in a quiet hotel room watching the sun rise over the distant coastline. He had played his hand flawlessly. Patrick was gone, Olivia was left in turmoil, and James himself was free. Free from betrayal, free from humiliation. There was no more James Bennett. Only Daniel Mercer remained. The morning after Olivia witnessed the horrifying FaceTime call, Patrick plummeting over the ship's railing, James's eerily calm expression. She sat curled up on her mother's couch, staring numbly at a muted daytime talk show. Her mind replayed the final image in a ceaseless loop. The shrill wind over dark water, James's grim face as he pushed Patrick into the black abyss. At first, her mother hovered near the doorframe, demanding answers Olivia couldn't give. "What on earth did you get yourself involved in?" her mother hissed. Olivia, still shocked, could only shake her head, refusing to elaborate. She realized that telling the truth, that her husband might have murdered a man on a cruise, would make her sound insane. Worse, it might implicate her in a scandal that could cost her the only thing she had left, her job. There was also a cold logic at play in Olivia's mind. If she claimed Patrick had been killed, the obvious question from authorities would be, how do you know? She had no tangible proof, only the horrific video chat that ended abruptly. She could already envision the humiliating fiasco of HR sleeping with her coworker. She would be fired immediately. And there was a part of her, a deeply self-preserving part, that was terrified of James. If he could do that to Patrick, what else might he be capable of? So she told no one. She kept the gruesome details locked inside, letting them gnaw at her soul. Over the next week, Olivia discovered James had completely erased her from their marital home. Unable to access her own bank accounts or credit cards, they had been summarily emptied or closed. She was effectively left penniless. The house title now bore only James's name. She had no leverage to fight back. Forging documentation or transferring house ownership behind her back might be illegal, but James's longtime career in finance had undoubtedly given him the expertise to conceal his tracks. Even if she attempted to challenge it, the legal costs would bankrupt her before she could make a dent. By Wednesday of that first week, she realized the seriousness of her predicament. She was living in her mother's cramped, musty guest room with boxes of her belongings stacked everywhere. Her mother was furious, not just because of the invasion of space, but also because Olivia refused to explain the real reasons behind James's sudden vendetta. The tension was suffocating. Still, Olivia kept her job, her one lifeline, by presenting a calm, unruffled front at her HR consulting firm. She pretended to be on an extended leave from her marriage, telling coworkers vague half-truths. James and I are having difficulties, or he needed some time alone. The less specific she was, the less likely they would pry. Her biggest fear was that some rumor about Patrick might surface at work. After all, Patrick had also been an HR professional at a related branch of the same large firm. But no official word came. Patrick was simply absent, with rumors ranging from he resigned to travel to he took a last-minute contract in Europe. Nobody seemed to know the truth, and Olivia didn't dare enlighten them. A month after James vanished, Olivia's adult children, Tyler, 28, and Miranda, 25, each began asking pointed questions. They weren't oblivious. They could see the changes in their mother's living situation. She was suddenly staying at Grandma's, had apparently been locked out of the house, and her phone calls sounded shaky. Tyler lived in Colorado. Miranda was at a nearby university town. Neither visited often, but the situation demanded an explanation. They confronted Olivia via a video call one evening, both of them on the screen from separate apartments, with Olivia perched on the edge of her mother's bed. "Mom, where's Dad?" Tyler asked, eyebrows knitted in concern. "His phone's been off for weeks." Olivia swallowed hard. She couldn't bear to lie outright, but the truth was too big, too terrifying. So she offered a carefully measured deception. "Your father wanted a fresh start. I can't go into details, but he left. He's okay. He just needed to step away." "Step away to where? And why does that require shutting off his phone?" Tyler asked, voice rising. "Mom, we're not kids anymore. We can handle the truth." Miranda's eyes flicked with anger. "Are you covering for him? Did he do something illegal?" Olivia's composure cracked. Her voice trembled as she insisted, "Look, I don't have all the answers. He told me he had to go. Something about an opportunity, wanting to be alone, wanting a new life. That's all I know. Her children didn't buy it. They exchanged dubious glances, concluding either that their mother had gone off the deep end or that she was protecting James from some colossal scandal. Over the following weeks, both Tyler and Miranda grew more distant. They called less, visited not at all. They were angry, fuming that their mother offered no coherent explanation for their father's disappearance, no closure, no honesty. They demanded the father's phone number, email, or any method of contact. Olivia had none. The tension boiled over in one final phone call where Miranda exploded. "We don't even know who you are anymore, Mom. If you won't tell us the truth, we can't trust you." Within days, both kids cut off regular communication. They severed ties with Olivia, at least for the time being, feeling utterly betrayed and abandoned. In their minds, it wasn't just their father who had vanished. It was the entire family unit. 6 months after James's disappearance, Olivia noticed clumps of hair in the shower drain. At first, she told herself it was normal. Everyone loses hair daily. But soon she saw more and more stray hairs on her pillow in the morning, in the bathroom sink, on her comb. Her once thick hair had always been her pride. She styled it meticulously, always presenting a polished look at the office. Now her hair was coming out in frightening handfuls. A dermatologist confirmed the likely cause: severe stress, possibly exacerbated by hormonal changes. "Your cortisol levels are through the roof," the doctor told her. "You need to manage your stress or it could worsen." Manage her stress? Olivia nearly laughed in the doctor's face. She was living in her mother's cramped house, estranged from her children, lying daily about her missing husband, haunted by the memory of a possible murder. How was she supposed to manage that? Within a year, her hair had thinned drastically along the crown. She wore wigs to hide bald patches, but the relentless stress only compounded. Eventually, she shaved off what little remained, telling colleagues she'd decided to embrace a bold style. In private, she wept at the reflection of her bare scalp in the mirror. By the time Olivia reached 60, the stress had ravaged both body and spirit. She was nearly bald. Only a few wisps remained, which she shaved off entirely every few days. She cycled through an array of colorful scarves, unwilling to invest in pricey wigs. Deep lines creased her face, a map of unrelenting turmoil. She took a part-time administrative job at a local college, earning enough to pay for minimal personal expenses. Her mother's health was also declining, so Olivia served as a sort of grudging caretaker in the evenings. Not a day passed that Olivia didn't think about James. In reflective, tormented moments, she pictured him in some exotic locale, living under an assumed name. Perhaps he had a new lover, someone who didn't disparage his weight or health issues. Or maybe he was alone, drifting from place to place, forever haunted by what he'd done. She wondered if, in his quiet moments, he felt even a shred of remorse. Sometimes she tried to imagine alternative endings. If she hadn't carried on with Patrick, if she hadn't verbally abused James when he was most vulnerable, if she had responded to his post-cancer depression with love instead of scorn, would James still be at home, cooking breakfast on a Sunday morning, reading the newspaper in his favorite chair? Would they be grandparents together, greeting Tyler and Miranda at Christmas with open arms? Regret gnawed at her. She recognized her own role in the tragedy. It didn't absolve James of murder, if that's truly what happened, but she knew her cruelty had set the stage.